And all of a sudden your brain goes like, this isn't what I remember it sounding like. This is not what I remember. This is not what it sounded like in the studio. There are going to be times when you do some work, whether it's a mix or a production, lay down a guitar part, lay a vocal track, whatever it is, a full production and mix. There are going to be times when hopefully all the time, that when you're done, you love it and that you feel as though you can't get enough of it and that it's awesome. And then there will come a time, and it has happened to me, and I know that it more than likely has happened to you. You will come across that piece of work, let's just say the next day or maybe a day later, when you're curious and you're like, yeah, let me listen to that track again that I loved so much on Monday, and here it is Wednesday, and you hit the play button, and 30 seconds into it, you are in a panic attack of sorts. You are nauseous. You're losing your mind that, oh my God, this thing sounds like ass. What was I thinking? What is going on? It sounds awful to me. It's terrible. I got to get back in the studio as soon as possible and fix this thing, or delete it, or re-record it, or change everything. All these things can go through your head when you are hit with that panic moment of hating what you're hearing after loving what you were hearing and making that move of saying like, yeah, it's done. This is cool. Or this track is done. Or this vocal is awesome. It's happened to me a million times. It happens less often now because I guess there's a certain point you will maybe get it, but it's happened to me. It's not like it never happens anymore. What causes it? I think there's a multitude of things. I think there is an imprint that goes into your head. It goes into your mind's eye, some people call it. And then what'll happen is the next time you hear it, especially if it catches you off guard, like you get in your car and you're like, yeah, let me listen to it in the car, and you dial it up on your phone and do the whole Bluetooth thing through the car. The change in environment can really throw you for a tizzy, because if you're used to hearing this thing in your recording studio on your playback speakers for 12 hours straight while you're working on it, I think there becomes a certain amount of nostalgia to the production. Like, you'll hear it in your head differently than it actually is. It's sort of like a great memory that lets you down when you confront that memory again. Is that too deep? I think it's real, though. So it's kind of like seeing a movie and think it's the greatest movie you've ever seen, and then 2 years later, you're like, oh, that movie's on. Let me watch it. That's like my, I thought that was an amazing movie, and then you watch it and you're like, oh, what was I thinking? That movie isn't any good. But it might be. It might be just as good as what your first impression was. It just could be that day. It could be the weather. Obviously, it could be your mood and your emotional state. So you have to kind of try and keep these things in mind when you're evaluating your work. Something you love the sound of can suddenly make you panic in that it's all wrong. Oh my God, what were we thinking? What was I thinking? I gotta pull the mix back up, and I have to tear the whole damn thing down. The kick drum's not loud enough. The snare drum's wrong. The vocal's out of tune. Tuning can really mess with you if you are in a weird state of mind that day. Things can sound out of tune. A vocal can sound off. The phrasing, the rhythm, all these things can happen to you. You have to kind of get to the point where you trust your judgment when you make the decision to hit print. When you commit to that thing, you have to be able to stick to your beliefs. I think if you find something that's clearly a mistake or an error, then you have to address it. You have to make that tough call that, like, oh yeah, I got to bring this thing back up. I got to pull it back up in the studio, and I got to work on it. I have to call the keyboard player back in because that part is just, way too busy. that vocal is not emotional enough and I have to get that thing recut. There are those days where you have to make the hard call, the tough call. But I'm here to say that we've all been there where we hear something that we loved and then not long afterwards, especially when you brush into it by surprise, or you listen to it in an off the cuff manner, like, oh yeah, put that on that Alexis Echo thing or whatever, and you're in a room that's all cement and tile and glass, and all of a sudden your brain goes like, this isn't what I remember it sounding like. This is not what I remember. This is not what it sounded like in the studio. Well, that's the other reality, is that it's not going to sound the same everywhere else than it does in your studio. Everybody gets into the whole thing of like, well, if it doesn't sound good in your studio and doesn't sound good on your little mono Oratone style speaker, then it's not going to sound good anywhere. Not true. Some productions are made mostly for clubs. Some are made mostly for audiophile, hi-fi kind of scenarios. You have to kind of cater to your audience too, in a way. If it's something that's going to be listened to like a jazz thing that's never going to be blasted with a sub in a car, you have to think differently and relate differently to what you're going for. That to me is somewhat obvious. Something like hip hop that is going to be bumped pretty loud in a club or in a car or even on headphones, it has to meet some requirements, some expectations. So then the opposite can happen also. You could be working on something or print something or finish something up for the day and think like, that is not good. It's terrible, in fact. I hated what I did today. I hated the guitar. Nothing felt right on the guitar. I'm laying this part for 2 hours and I just have to shut this thing down and maybe I'll just move on to something else. And the next day you pull up that track and you're like, wait a minute, this guitar is decent. It's actually more than decent. I really like this guitar. I really like this vocal, or I really like this mix. I thought I hated it yesterday. It is a moving target at times, the way things will hit you, the impression that you will get when you're listening, depending on where, when, and how, and with who, what conversation you just had before you listened to it. If you have a conversation with someone who's, tearing your head off about like, oh yeah, I just listened to such and such thing, and I love the vocal, it's so crispy and loud and blah, blah, blah. And you listen to it and you're like, yeah, wow, that is a really loud, crispy vocal. That sounds really good. And then you go to listen to your thing where you have a different frame of mind and you don't like mixing with a super loud, crispy vocal. All of a sudden, you could start questioning your work. Is this good? Am I on the right track? Did I screw this up? These are the things you're just going to go through. You have to be willing to take the ride and understand that this is for everyone. This is for everyone. I've worked with producers who have come back in the next day fearing what they were going to hear from the previous day's work. And they're like, all right, put it up. Let me take a listen to it. And then they'll go like, oh, wow. That's a lot better than I thought it was, Or they will leave the studio the previous night high-fiving. Let's go to the club. Oh my God, we really nailed it today. This is awesome. Come in the next day like, yeah, put it up. Let me hear it again. And everyone in the room is like, yeah, ooh, it isn't as good as we thought it was yesterday, is it? So then you have to, take that ride and say, do we have to make a move? Should we put it aside for a day? Should we revisit this thing, the obligatory revisit? Or is it something that needs to be scrapped? I've seen that happen where like, everybody loved it, and then everybody didn't. I'm not telling anybody to quit the business. This is the way it goes sometimes. I just had this on my mind. I wanted to get this out while I was thinking about it a lot, because I listened to some stuff today that I was like, yeah, that does sound good. It sounds different than I remember it, but it does sound good. Then I listened to another thing, and I listened to it, and I'm like, it sounds like they worked on this too much. It sounds overcooked. It lacked spontaneity. It wasn't too slick. It was too boring, is the only way I can describe it. I think if anything, with art in particular, if there's one thing you don't want to be, is boring. You'd rather have someone say it sucks or it's great, but you don't want them to be indifferent. And an overcooked production, one that has like lost its mojo, gets the indifferent stamp. That is one of those things where you might have to like yank the faders down and give it another try to find some other energy. All right, take it easy. Hitting the button.